The 9,669th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is Children and Armed Conflict: How to Advance Our Collective Norms Towards Protecting Children and Ending All Grave Violations. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Andorra, Armenia, Australia, Austria, Bahrain, Bangladesh, Belgium, Brazil, Bulgaria, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Croatia, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Denmark, Dominican Republic, Egypt, El Salvador, Georgia, Germany, Greece, Guatemala, India, Indonesia, Iraq, Ireland, and the Islamic Republic of Iran, Israel, Italy, Jordan, Kazakhstan, Lebanon, Liechtenstein, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Malaysia, Maldives, Mexico, Morocco, Myanmar, Nepal, Pakistan, the Philippines, Poland, Portugal, Qatar, Romania, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, Spain, the Syrian Arab Republic, Thailand, Turkey, Ukraine, United Arab Emirates, Uruguay, Vietnam, and Yemen to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. I propose that the Council invite the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in the meeting in accordance with the provisional rules of procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided. I also propose that the Council invite the Deputy Permanent Observer of the Observer State of the Holy See to the United Nations to participate in the meeting in accordance with the provisional rules of procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting: Ms. Virginia Gamba, Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflict; Mr. Ted Chaiban, Deputy Executive Director of Humanitarian Action and Supply Operations of the United Nations Children's Fund; His Excellency Mr. Ban Ki-moon, former United Nations Secretary General and the Deputy Chair of the Elders; and a child briefer. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to document S/2024/384, the report of the Secretary General on Children and Armed Conflict, and the document S/2024/468, a letter dated 12 June 2024 from the Permanent Representative of the Republic of Korea to the United Nations, addressed to the President of the Security Council, transmitting a concept paper on the item under consideration. I now give the floor to Ms. Virginia Gamba.
Council President, Ambassador Joonkook Hwang, former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, Deputy Executive Director of UNICEF Ted Chaiban, esteemed civil society briefer Jean Bier, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I thank the Republic of Korea for convening today's Security Council open debate. I am grateful to my co-briefers and my colleagues across the world who work every day towards protecting and improving the lives of the most vulnerable. The information I present to you today has been obtained in context of great hardship and under incredibly difficult circumstances during a deadly year for United Nations personnel and aid workers. I remind you that, at the request of the Security Council, the information contained in the Secretary General's report was verified by applying the strict methodology of the monitoring and reporting mechanism. Due to extreme challenges in monitoring and in access to children in 2023, and the few and diminishing resources available to monitoring and reporting activities, these figures do not represent the full scale of grave violations suffered by children in all the situations narrated in this report. Furthermore, Section 5 was modified to recognize measures taken by listed parties to improve the protection of children and to emphasize the primary responsibility of states to protect their populations, modifications which render redundant the separation of lists contained in the annexes to the report. Therefore, Annex 1 is a single list divided between governmental actors and non-state armed groups. Mr. President, in the 25 countries and one regional situation covered by my mandate, the United Nations verified an appalling 32,990 grave violations against 22,557 children in 2023. This is the highest number of annual violations in almost 10 years. Solely when compared to 2022, which already marked a severe deterioration for children, grave violations have increased by 21%. Across the globe, from Port-au-Prince to Mogadishu, from Kharkiv and the kibbutz to Khartoum, from Rafah to Bethlehem and kibbutz Be'eri, from Borno State to Arauca Department, and from Mopti to Rakhine State, children bore the brunt of multiplying and escalating crises. In combat zones, in displacement camps, in urban areas, and in their homes and schools, they experience horrific violence. The brutality of violations escalated in many situations, for example in Haiti, where children were gang raped, decapitated with machetes, and burnt alive by armed gangs. The grave violations verified with the highest numbers in 2023 were the killing and maiming of children, followed by recruitment and use, denial of humanitarian access, and abduction. Firstly, a staggering 5,301 children were killed and another 6,348 maimed and or injured, marking a shocking rise of 35% over previous years. The use of explosive weapons in densely populated areas, as well as deliberate and indiscriminate attacks against civilians and civilian objects, had a particularly grim impact on children. In countless instances, children were killed and maimed in direct attacks, by airstrikes, by drones, or when picking up objects to play with that turned out to be explosives. In Afghanistan, for example, a 10-year-old boy was killed and his 12-year-old brother maimed when they played with an unexploded ordnance that promptly detonated. Whether armed forces or non-state armed groups, all parties to conflict contributed to this deadly harvest. Secondly, the recruitment and use of children also surged during 2023, with 8,655 cases verified, of which some 15% were girls, who also bore the brunt of multiple violations while recruited or used. In Somalia, for example, Al-Shabaab recruited 10 children aged 15 to 17 in a single event and then took them to a training camp. In the Sudan, the Rapid Support Forces Armed Group recruited 74 boys aged 14 to 17 in a single quarter and used them as combatants. 54 of them were subsequently killed during clashes with the Sudanese armed forces. In multiple situations, children were routinely used in combat and in support roles, placing them at significant risk and causing trauma and death. Children were further punished for their alleged or actual association with armed groups or on national security grounds. 2,491 children were deprived of liberty, exposing them to ill treatment and human rights violations, including torture and sexual violence. In addition, 31,000 children continued to be deprived of liberty in Hol and Rosh camps in northeast Syria, where they are deliberately denied access to humanitarian relief and essential medical treatment. I urge member states to treat children actually or allegedly associated with armed forces or groups, including those designated as terrorists by the United Nations, primarily as victims, to prioritize their best interests and to give child protection actors access to them. Thirdly, child abductions also continued at high levels, with 4,356 child victims verified in 2023. Abduction was often perpetrated in conjunction with other grave violations, specifically recruitment and use, killing and maiming, and sexual violence, and many of these affected mostly girls. In the Sudan, a girl was abducted by the Rapid Support Forces armed group, kept for 5 days, and repeatedly raped to the extent that it permanently maimed her. Overall, the number of children that were affected by multiple violations increased, and rape and other forms of sexual violence dramatically added to this equation. Grave violations against girls also increased globally. In 2023, rape and other forms of sexual violence increased by 25% and affected 1,470 children, especially girls. Gang rape continued unabated, with high numbers in the Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Haiti. Prevalently, girls are recruited or abducted for sexual exploitation and then violated repeatedly. In 2014, in Iraq, for example, a girl was abducted by Daesh when she was only 5 years old. She was then sold between Daesh members for sexual exploitation and was sexually abused until she was rescued in June 2023 at age 14. Yet, most cases of sexual violence are never reported due to stigma, the risk of reprisals, harmful gender norms, and lack of access to safe reporting channels, survivor assistance, and justice. Collective violations also increased during 2023, with attacks on schools and hospitals continuing to deprive children of education and of health. Here, 1,650 attacks were verified and had devastating impacts on children and their communities. In Cameroon, perpetrators opened fire on a primary school where children were registering to receive their certificates. The school had to be closed immediately. The use of schools and hospitals for military purposes remained of severe concern and exposed teachers, students, medical personnel, and patients to harm. It also led to damage, closure, or complete destruction of civilian infrastructure. Nowhere was this more prevalent than in the Gaza Strip, in Ukraine, and in the Sudan. A staggering 72 million children worldwide were out of school in 2023 due to conflict and crisis. In some cases, the denial of education was particularly harsh for girls, as registered in Afghanistan. Lastly, the denial of humanitarian access rose to alarming levels, with 5,205 violations verified. This marks an increase of over 32%. In war, when infrastructure delivering protection, education, healthcare, food, water, and other essential services is weakened or destroyed, the only hope left often comes in the form of humanitarian assistance. But this too is increasingly under attack, as seen in Gaza and in Sudan. Over 190 United Nations and other humanitarian staff were killed in Gaza, and nearly all critical civilian infrastructure was destroyed. In the Sudan, a humanitarian convoy due to evacuate vulnerable civilians came under attack last year. The incident killed 2 people and injured 7, including 3 humanitarian staff. Children with disabilities, displaced children, and otherwise marginalized children were particularly vulnerable to grave violations and broadly lacked assistance tailored to their needs. Girls continue to be disproportionately impacted by rape and other forms of sexual violence. Boys were the main victims of recruitment and use and abduction, while the number of boy victims of sexual violence also increased by 25%. Mr. President, the children and armed conflict situations with the highest numbers of grave violations during 2023 were Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory, including Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Myanmar, Somalia, Nigeria, and the Sudan. Violations against children also experienced increases in situations where child protection was low, such as in Ethiopia, Haiti, Mozambique, and the Sahel and Lake Chad regions. In Myanmar, the situation escalated so drastically that a 123% increase in grave violations were verified. The conflict in the Gaza Strip, the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and in Israel, has escalated to an unprecedented scale, inflicting unimaginable suffering on thousands of children. I am appalled by the killing and maiming and abduction of children by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups, and by the number of children killed and maimed by Israeli armed and security forces in the Gaza Strip and the occupied West Bank. Violations across the entire situation increased by 155%, with 8,009 grave violations against 4,360 children verified. Some 23,000 additional violations against Palestinian and Israeli children have been reported and are commencing verification processes. Behind every incident of violations to the rights of children in situations of armed conflict lies the unique, abhorrent experience of one child. We can never forget this. Assessing the grave violations committed against children in this situation, the Secretary General has listed in the annexes of this report the Israeli armed and security forces for the killing and maiming of children and for attacks on schools and hospitals. And taking into account the 7th of October 2023 attack on Israeli civilians, including children, by Palestinian armed groups, the Secretary General has listed Hamas Isa al-Din al-Qassam brigades and Palestinian Islamic Jihad's al-Quds brigades for killing and maiming and abduction of children. In the Sudan, the situation spiraled out of control. The dramatic increase in violations by 480% is simply appalling. Repeated attacks on schools and hospitals by both the Rapid Support Forces armed group and Sudanese armed forces in the context of a collapsing civilian infrastructure and an abysmal humanitarian situation brought unbearable torment upon children. The report reflects the plight of children in the Sudan and has led to the Sudanese armed forces being listed in the annexes of the report for the killing and maiming of children and for attacks on schools and hospitals. The Rapid Support Forces armed group have also been listed for recruitment and use, killing and maiming, sexual violence, and attacks on schools and hospitals. Lastly, another Sudanese armed group, Third Front Tamazush, has also been listed for recruitment and use. Meanwhile, while the eyes of the world were focusing on major conflicts such as those in Israel, Gaza, and Ukraine, children were further verified as having suffered violations by armed groups and parties in Burkina Faso, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Mali, and Sudan, where parties have also been listed. With the decisions of the Secretary General in the annex of this year's report, 75 parties are now listed as perpetrators of grave violations globally, including 10 state actors and 65 armed groups. Of these, over 50 parties are persistent perpetrators listed for 5 years or longer. Mr. President, cooperation, solidarity, and the political will to mitigate, stop, and ultimately end and prevent violations against children is the only way forward. This is also demonstrated in this year's report. Faced with devastating setbacks in 2023, the UN has continued its constructive engagement with parties to conflict, yielding progress in some situations, including in the Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Iraq, Mozambique, Nigeria, the Philippines, Somalia, the Syrian Arab Republic, Ukraine, and Yemen. I recently signed an action plan with the opposition Syrian National Army, including Harar al-Sham and Army of Islam, to end and prevent the recruitment and use and killing and maiming of children. It is to be hoped that children will quickly be released from recruitment and that military actions will strive to better avoid child violations because of this commitment. In Iraq, during my visit in January 2024, I welcomed the full implementation of the action plan between the Popular Mobilization Forces and the United Nations. This action plan was signed last year and is now fully operational, as seen in the significant decrease in the figures of grave violations in that children and armed conflict situation. In Ukraine, although still at war, the swift implementation of a joint prevention plan between the government of Ukraine and the United Nations led to a significant decrease in grave violations by the Ukrainian armed forces in 2023. Further, the report noted the unilateral measures put in place by the Russian Federation, the decrease of child violations attributed to the listed party, and the ongoing dialogue between the United Nations and the Russian Federation promoting the signature of a joint action plan to end and prevent violations against children. The signature of prevention and/or protection action plans, including the adoption of handover protocols, age assessment guidelines, and child protection policies and legislation, have marked progress and improved the lives of children. Importantly, more than 7,650 children formerly associated with armed forces or groups have been released from their ranks, and many of those have received reintegration support from the UN and its partners last year. Mr. President, this annual report once again shows that children continue to be the direct and indirect victims of armed conflict. With trepidation, I must insist that special protections for children under international human rights law, international humanitarian law, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child are being disrespected and eroded across the globe in alarming proportions. And while almost half of the verified grave violations were committed by non-state armed groups, government forces and explosive remnants of war together were responsible for the other half. This is unacceptable. Non-state armed groups are committing all 6 grave violations, whereas armed forces seem to be particularly prone to perpetrate the killing and maiming of children, attacks on schools and hospitals, and the denial of humanitarian access. Mr. President, there are many reasons for armed violence, ranging from the changing nature, complexity, expansion, and intensification of armed conflict, the emergence of new armed groups, cross-border conflict and intercommunal violence, to the devastating impacts of acute humanitarian crisis and climate emergencies on all peoples. This explains in part the justification provided by parties to conflict on the reasons why they engage in armed violence, ranging from root causes of conflict to territorial to economic control of lands and our peoples, and from sovereignty disputes to national security imperatives. However, one thing is clear: armed violence is wreaking havoc on children. Let me remind all warring parties, whether state armed forces or non-state armed groups, that when they resort to armed force, in contradiction with the Charter of the United Nations, they cannot do so at the cost of the lives and well-being of children. Let me be clear: there is no excuse for harming children during armed conflict. Finally, if political will is found to improve the lives of children in situations of armed conflict, then the tools at our disposal already exist. One of these tools is this report. Although not a legal determination, the main purpose of this report is to focus the attention of member states on grave violations against children, and to call on the parties to conflict to take immediate action to end and prevent violations against children. The objective of the annexes of this report goes beyond naming and shaming because it is guided by the offer of immediate engagement between the United Nations and listed parties to end and prevent the use and abuse of children for, in, and by armed conflict. Engagement is the second tool available to this mandate, to engage with parties to better protect, prevent, and remedy the fate of children in armed conflict. This tool is a mandate of the Security Council and is often expressed in the joint signature of action or prevention plans or commitments with parties to conflict. Such agreed engagement comprises close collaboration with parties to conflict to put in place robust child protection systems, especially accountability mechanisms that prioritize justice and remedies for victims. And the tools available encompass measures such as comprehensive reintegration and assistance programs, explosive ordnance risk education, clearance and victim assistance, the mainstreaming of child protection in peace and security processes, the strengthening of regional partnerships, and the development of intersectional approaches to child protection. A very important aspect of this engagement tool is that the Security Council has clearly indicated that when the United Nations engages for the better protection of children with warring parties, including non-state armed groups, nothing that is done towards that lofty objective can confer additional legitimacy to the parties in conflict. Mr. President, it is timely that today's debate includes a focus on child protection in the context of the drawdown of peacekeeping operations and special political missions. In the face of ever-evolving challenges, our organization must remain agile and adaptable to ensure the best possible outcomes for children. Expert capacities must be sustained and strengthened, including during and after mission transitions, and I strongly recommend conducting lessons learned exercises in this regard. Let me conclude by reaffirming that respect for international law, especially humanitarian and human rights law, is the minimum prerequisite for the protection of children. But despite the solid international consensus that has been reached on these matters, parties to conflict blatantly trample on child's rights with little or no consequences. This must stop. The report of the Secretary General illustrates starkly that we need to address new and emerging peace and security challenges by putting children at the center of our action. We must remind ourselves of the importance of complying with the very basic legal and moral principles that the international community once agreed on, as framed in the Convention of the Rights of the Child and its relevant protocols. Children must be protected from man-made conflict if we aim to break the cycle of violence that has put the world at the brink of extinction so many times before. Let us be co-responsible for our children. Let us push for peaceful resolution of disputes. But let us also protect our children when we fail to bring them peace. Thank you.
Ms. Gamba for her briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Ted Chaiban.
Council President, Ambassador Joonkook Hwang, former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, Deputy Chair of the Elders, Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children in Armed Conflict, Ms. Virginia Gamba, esteemed child briefer Janvier, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. In 2023, the United Nations verified 32,990 grave violations against children, the highest number ever recorded during the CAC mandate, and a 21% increase over 2022, which previously held the title of worst year ever. The numbers neither capture the full extent of grave violations nor the deep physical and psychosocial harm they have caused to children's lives, families, and communities. The numbers are, however, indicative of larger trends and patterns affecting children. More children are being killed and maimed, more are being raped and subjected to other forms of sexual violence, and more instances of denial of humanitarian access to children, all by a significant margin. I would like to highlight 3 of the situations included in the Secretary General's report. Children in Israel and the State of Palestine continue to endure incomprehensible suffering, particularly in the Gaza Strip, where the scale of death and destruction is staggering. In 2023, 4,312 Palestinian and 70 Israeli children were verified as killed or maimed, representing 37% of all verified cases of killing and maiming included in the report. Most casualties were caused by explosive weapons in populated areas. However, more than 23,000 reported cases of children killed and maimed during 2023 have yet to be verified because of insecurity, movement restrictions, and significant risks to humanitarian personnel operating in Gaza. In addition, the bodies of thousands of the missing children remain buried under the rubble. These numbers do not include the thousands of violations reported so far in 2024. After nearly 9 months of horrible conflict, UNICEF and other humanitarian actors are still struggling to reach children in need. This is because we continue to face obstacles to the safe movements of aid into and throughout Gaza, and these obstacles are directly related to the increasing number of acutely malnourished children. UNICEF urges parties to the conflict to comply with their obligations to protect children and to immediately enter into a complete ceasefire, as this Council has called for in its resolutions 2712 and 2725. Turning now to Sudan, where after more than a year of war, the country is now home to the largest child displacement crisis in the world, with an estimated 4.6 million children displaced internally and across borders, and an almost 500% increase in grave violations. Countless children have been exposed to horrific violence. The UN has verified the killing and maiming of 1,244 children by parties to the conflict in 2023, and rampant grave violations have been reported so far in 2024. Earlier this month, at least 55 children were reportedly killed or maimed in an attack on Wad al-Nura in Al Jazeera state. And now, thousands of children in Al-Fashir in Darfur are facing daily clashes and indiscriminate shelling while parts of the city remain under siege. According to credible reports, more than 500 children have been killed or maimed in Al-Fashir since the start of May. Meanwhile, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the intensifying conflict in the east has led to the worst humanitarian crisis in the country since 2003, leaving 7 million people displaced. In 2023, the UN verified 281 incidents of sexual violence, including rape, gang rape, forced marriage, and sexual slavery, with most violations perpetrated against girls. The use of sexual violence as a modus operandi of armed groups is spiraling. During my recent visits to the DRC, I met with adolescent girls who had run away with their siblings when their village were attacked and who now headed their households. I remember 16-year-old Florence, who fled with her 3 brothers and sisters to Goma after having experienced terrible violence. Making matters worse, the conflict in the east is intensifying at the same time as the departure of MONUSCO has begun. There is a very real risk that the humanitarian crisis in the DRC could soon become a catastrophe. Mr. President, these are just 3 of the 26 situations covered in the Secretary General's report. Thousands of other children in countries like Burkina Faso, Haiti, Mali, Myanmar, Ukraine, and Yemen suffered grave violations in 2023, and millions more remain at risk. The CAC mandate has been in place for nearly 3 decades. This year's report shows plainly that despite the global consensus on the need to protect children during war, parties to conflict are not fulfilling their obligations under international law. These grave violations do not happen on their own. They result from the choices and actions of perpetrators, state and non-state parties to conflict. Mr. President, the CAC agenda is an effective tool to mitigate the impact of conflict on children. This past year has seen notable examples. As highlighted by SRSG Gamba, progress was achieved by the government of Iraq on their action plan and by Ukraine on their prevention plan, while the opposition Syrian National Army committed to an action plan to end and prevent the recruitment and use and the killing and maiming of children. And importantly, with the support of UN mission and civil society partners, UNICEF provided protection and reintegration support to nearly 11,000 children previously recruited and used by armed forces and armed groups. UNICEF appreciates the dedicated financial support for the children and armed conflict agenda from, among others, Norway and Belgium, following the Oslo Conference on Protecting Children in Armed Conflict last year, without which this work would not have been possible. Mr. President, these examples show that meaningful progress is possible, especially when there is military and political will, constructive engagement and collaboration. But more is needed given the increased and verified violation. Distinguished council members, members of the international community, you are in a unique position to help. We urge you on behalf of children in conflict to take 4 key actions. First, we call on you to reaffirm your strong support for the Children in Armed Conflict mandate, the monitoring and reporting mechanism, and the larger CAC architecture. The independently verified and robust UN data before you, provided by this mechanism, is a core tool of the mandate. It informs all of our actions towards tangible results for children. This work is often undertaken in constrained conditions at great personal risk. Second, we ask this Council to recommit to and promote the consensus that children should be spared from harm and violence. Council members and the international community should engage and reinforce sustained diplomatic efforts to end conflicts and to prevent escalation of conflicts. Humanitarian peace and development actors all stand ready to support the process, but we cannot do this without you. In this regard, we urge the Security Council to take further meaningful action to alleviate the suffering of children in Sudan. In addition, state and non-state actors that provide material, financial, and diplomatic support to parties committing grave violations against children also bear responsibility. They should ensure that any support they provide to parties is consistent with their obligations under international humanitarian law and use their influence to ensure that parties respect international law to protect the lives and well-being of children. Third, we need your support to advocate for humanitarian space for the United Nations to continue engaging with all parties to conflict, to develop prevention and protection tools like action plans, and for humanitarian access to assist and protect children. And lastly, adequate resources are needed to fund not only the MRM mechanism, but also specialized child-centered services for survivors of grave violations and advocacy to prevent and end these violations. This is particularly urgent in the context of withdrawals of peacekeeping or special political missions. I remember when I led children affected by armed conflict responses 20 years ago in Sri Lanka and Sudan. We had the resources not only to cover monitoring and reporting mechanisms, but to support the reintegration of children released from armed groups and work on preventing grave violations. Mr. President, rest assured that UNICEF stands ready as a steadfast partner in these efforts. I hope you will join us all in putting children first. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Choi-ban for his briefing. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Ban Ki-moon.
Mr. President and distinguished members of the Security Council, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor for me to have this opportunity to brief the Security Council on such an important topic, children and armed conflict. Before I begin, I would like to extend my warmest congratulations to you, Mr. President, and your leadership will bear good success in ensuring the global peace and security. Today, I'm speaking here in my capacity as Deputy Chair of the Elders, the group of independent former leaders founded by Nelson Mandela who work for peace, justice, human rights, and a sustainable planet. Mr. President, the protection of innocent lives lies at the heart of all of the elders' endeavors. Children in armed conflict are the most innocent victims of all, and it is a universal moral obligation to protect them from harm and exploitation. I commend the work by the Special Representative of the Secretary General and the report presented today, which describes how acute the issue of children and armed conflict has been over the course of 2023. It should be a matter of shame to every state represented here today that innocent children continue to pay such a terrible price in the multiple conflicts being waged across our world. I'm shocked and outraged that grave violations against children rose 21% in 2023, with a 35% rise in the killing and maiming of children in the same period. This reflects a persistent and blatant disregard for international law by those perpetrating these violations, whether government forces or non-state armed actors, and the sense of impunity that they will not be held accountable for their actions. To give just one example, the United Nations has verified more than 8,000 grave violations against 4,247 Palestinian children and 113 Israeli children in 2023, reflecting the shocking scale and human cost of the current conflict. There should be no impunity for those who commit crimes against children anywhere in the world, whether they be states or armed groups, in autocracies or democracies. Such distinctions mean nothing to the parents of murdered children, nor should they to the institutions charged with upholding international justice. The statistics of the report in the report of the Secretary General tell their own story. But I know from my own experience that the trauma experienced by children in armed conflict cannot be captured in figures alone. As a young boy during the Korean War in early 1950s, I experienced the trauma and wrenching displacement of fleeing my home during the conflict, with the death and destruction all around me. The human sufferings I witnessed as a young boy, as I fled my burning villages with my parents, continue to haunt me in the days and years to come. No child should endure what I did as a young boy, and what countless other boys and girls still do today, from Gaza and Israel to Ukraine, Sudan, to Myanmar, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, to Yemen, and so many other conflicts that are not on the radar of the world's policymakers or media. One of the landmark reports on children and armed conflict was written 28 years ago by Madame Graça Machel, the former freedom fighter and education minister of Mozambique, who today serves as my fellow deputy chair of the elders. Her findings are as relevant today as they were when she first presented them to the General Assembly in 1996. She said, I quote, "More and more of the world is being sucked into a desolate moral vacuum. This is a space devoid of the most basic human values, a space in which children are slaughtered, raped, and maimed, and exposed to extreme brutality," unquote. The situation today is a damning reflection of the collective failure of political will over the past 3 decades to address the issue. But Graça Machel's powerful report did lead to changes, not least the creation of the mandate of the Secretary General's Special Representative on Children and Armed Conflict. All Security Council members, and particularly the 5 permanent members, have a responsibility to protect and support this mandate in the interest of children worldwide. At country level, alongside essential monitoring and reporting work, the mandate includes working with the conflict parties on the steps they need to take to end violations and ensure the protection of children. Identifying those responsible for grave violations, as the report does through the compilation of its annual list, is the first step towards constructive engagement, action, and accountability. In this regard, the inclusion of Israeli armed and security forces and Palestinian armed groups on the list is an important step in terms of seeking accountability. Where peacekeeping and political mission are drawing down, there must be a commitment to provide sufficient resources so this vital work continues. Attacks on places that are supposed to provide care and protection for children, such as schools, hospitals, are an increasing pattern in multiple conflict settings, including Gaza, Ukraine, Myanmar, and Sudan. Member states of the United Nations should endorse and implement the commitment outlined in the Safe Schools Declaration, which has so far garnered the support from 120 countries. All attacks on children in armed conflict constitute a grave violation of human rights, but the most inhumane are those involving sexual violence. As someone who has championed women's rights and gender equality through my life, and particularly while serving as UN Secretary General, I am hugely concerned at the continuously high level of sexual violence against girls in conflict worldwide. These violations have devastating consequences, not only for survivors, their families, and communities, but also for those children born of sexual violence who deserve special recognition and support. As my fellow elder and Nobel laureate Dr. Denis Mukwege so rightly says, I quote, "Survivors of sexual violence have the right to truth, justice, reparation, and guarantees of non-repetition, unquote. And just as survivors and their children have rights, so Security Council members have responsibilities to ensure these rights are respected and perpetrators are held accountable. Mr. President, distinguished Council members, allow me to close by speaking frankly about the architecture of peace and security at the center of which the Security Council sits. The system, patently ineffective, and it is failing to perform its most fundamental function, upholding peace and security and protecting innocent lives. The Council is deadlocked on the conflicts of the day, as some permanent members abuse the veto responsibility granted to them in 1945. Major conflicts rage unabated due to a lack of political will to prioritize resolution. This September, the Secretary General will host the Summit of the Future. Specific reform to the Security Council are finally being examined in intergovernmental negotiation. A formula for reform of the Council that balances increased representation with effectiveness must be found. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I call on all UN member states, including the permanent members of the Security Council, to seize this opportunity to build a better, safer future for the children of the world. Impunity for those who violate their fundamental rights must end. History will judge your efforts. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Ban for his briefing. I now give the floor to the child briefer.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. When I was born 16 years ago, there were already armed conflicts in the east of Democratic Republic of Congo. It is always the same situation, worsening from one day to the next, and harder still for those who are the greatest victim of conflict, children. I am an example of this. I was forced to join an armed group while I was walking to school. It is time for the whole world to rally behind the Democratic Republic of Congo and take tougher measures to put an end to all the armed conflicts and dangers facing children so that they can fully enjoy their rights, including schooling. 2 months ago, during armed attacks on 2 of our neighboring villages, children were targeted for abduction and forced to join armed groups, while others were abducted to enable armed groups to hold their families to ransom. This leads to the murder of many children whose families do not have the means to pay the ransoms demanded. Other children are raped, especially girls, and as if this were not enough, schools and hospitals are attacked during armed conflicts and used as military bases by armed actors, while benches and desks used as firewood and other classrooms used as toilets. My message is to see protection and security reinforced in all areas, especially those controlled by armed groups, so that schools and hospitals are safe, put an end to the use of schools and hospitals for military purposes, and see the release of all children recruited into armed groups so that they can once again enjoy their rights. How my life has been negatively impacted by armed conflicts. I used to wake up early every day to go to work, and often I'd go with the harvesters to collect the agricultural produce from the fields so that we could have something to eat at home, where I was paid 2,000 Congolese francs, the equivalent of $1 at the time. I was 11 at the time. At that time, I heard about boys being kidnapped and taken into the bush by armed groups. I woke anxiously, fearing that one day it would be the same for me. My parents had no way of helping me to leave the village and move to a safer place. One day, I was on my way to school, and it was afternoon when I was studying. 3 of us, 1 girl and 2 boys, came across a group of armed men from the bush. They stopped in front of us. We were scared and intimidated, and we started to think about death already, but by God's grace, we hadn't been killed. We cried and trembled, begging them to let us go home to our families, but they wouldn't listen. That's when they started wiping us and keeping us in the bush. We were heavily guarded, and they had orders to kill anyone who tried to flee. I had to leave school to start serving this armed group by force. In the bush, apart from weapons training exercises that lasts 3 months, we were used as transporters of food that the armed groups looted from other people's fields, and our school bags were burnt. Girls were also abducted. Some became wives of the chiefs, while others were taken by other soldiers. During the fighting, many were exposed to being killed by the enemy, and others were killed by their groups themselves for fear that they would divulge their secrets if caught by the military. Life hasn't rosy, because dry cassava was the main food, which scared me, but I was also afraid of wild animals in the bush, especially when they sent us out to steal cassava and sweet potatoes from other people's fields at night. They also forced us to rob vehicles on the roads. After 3 years of very difficult life in the bush, with no hope of seeing my parents and little brothers again, I escaped one day when they sent us, as usual, to look for something to eat for the group. I fell into the hands of the army, who arrested me and sent me to the military dungeon, as I had military effects on me. I was released a few days later, and then received support from my social and education reintegration. The Congolese government's child demobilization program gave me a certificate of release sometime later. For my protection in the community, as some people were pointing the fingers at me for still being associated with the armed group, even though I was already in civilian life. Now that I'm back at school, I'm working with my colleagues in the Children's Parliament to raise awareness in communities to ensure that children's rights are respected. I want to urge the United Nations Security Council to work together to provide assistance to children affected by conflicts. This assistance will help protect children, help them gain access to education and health care, and protect children from violence in environments where children's rights are violated, especially in areas under the control of armed groups. I ask you all to take up the cause of defending children's rights internationally and in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Many children have no access to education as a result of the never-ending crisis, and families on the move are unable to send their children to school and meet other needs. Education saves the child from joining armed groups and other heavy labor unless forced to do so. Once an adult, the child who has studied understands the importance of having his children study in turn. In the long term, his studies will give him the opportunity to become the country's leader. Many Congolese children still need the help of the world, like the one I received, from their protection and survival during these times of armed conflict. And I can never wish for another child to go through what I did. Thank you.
I thank the child briefer for his briefing. I now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Malta.
President, I begin by thanking you for organizing this important open debate. I also thank Saris G. Gamba, former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and Deputy Executive Director Chaiban for their briefings. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Janvier for sharing his experience with us. President, Malta is deeply concerned that grave violations against children continue to escalate. As stated in the Secretary General's report, the number of children killed, maimed, and violated against reached unmatched numbers. The use of explosive weapons in populated areas has led to an alarming rise in grave violations. The continued increase of incidents of the denial of humanitarian access is equally troubling. As outlined at the briefing held during Malta's presidency in April, such denial often increases vulnerability to other violations of children's rights. Malta calls on all parties to allow and facilitate unimpeded, safe, and timely humanitarian access. We look forward to the development of the guidance note by the Office of the Special Representative for Children and Armed Conflict for monitors on this violation. We remain fully committed to the UN's and Office of the SRSG CAC's critical work. As chair of the CAC working group, we underline the importance of continued objectivity, impartiality, and transparency in the Secretary General's annual report on CAC. The annexed list of perpetrators is a critical tool to end violations and protect children in situations of armed conflict. It is important to apply the same standards of scrutiny to all parties in all situations. Malta therefore welcomes the latest SG report and recalls that states have the primary responsibility to protect their populations and that international law must be respected by all parties to conflict. In Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory, Malta is deeply concerned that violations against children have reached an unprecedented scale, including during the attacks of 7 October and subsequent escalations in Gaza and the occupied West Bank. Reports of attacks on schools and hospitals, the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, abduction, detention, and ill-treatment of children are alarming. In Sudan, the increase in killing and maiming, reports of widespread conflict-related sexual violence, recruitment, as well as continued hindrance to humanitarian access have created an untenable situation. Mitigating measures are urgently needed to address these violations. We are also strongly concerned by the deterioration in many other conflicts, such as in Haiti, Myanmar, Somalia, and Ukraine. In Ukraine, we urge the Russian Federation to enhance prevention measures and develop a joint action plan to end and prevent grave violations against children. The SG report points to 26 conflict situations, some of which have been long-standing. Malta welcomes the continued engagement by some parties to conflict with the United Nations and urges all others to immediately engage and put in measures to better protect children. President, children's exposure to grave violations are also shaped by gender norms, with different risks for girls and boys. We urge better gender analysis to strengthen survivor-centered approaches to improve gender-responsive child protection. We take this opportunity to remind Member States of our collective responsibility to protect civilians from harm, especially children. We call on countries to endorse the Paris Principles and Commitments, the Safe Schools Declaration, the Vancouver Principles, and the Political Declaration on the Protection of Civilians from the Use of Explosive Weapons in Populated Areas. President, we are also concerned about the loss of child protection capacity during withdrawals of peacekeeping missions. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, the withdrawal of MONUSCO from South Kivu is negatively impacting the ability of child protection advisors to monitor and report and to conduct advocacy. This Council must continue to consider the impact of withdrawals on child protection capacity, ensure sufficient resources, and strive so that gains made over the years are not lost during the transition period. In closing, President, Malta urges for the continued support towards the CAC mandate and the monitoring and reporting mechanism on grave violations against children. Malta will continue to prioritize the protection of children and engage with Council members to achieve more progress in the Working Group on Children and Armed Conflict. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I thank former UN Secretary General and Deputy Chair of the Elders, His Excellency Ban Ki-moon, SRSG Virginia Gamba, UNICEF Deputy Executive Director Mr. Chaiban for their sobering briefing, and I thank Janvier for so bravely sharing his story. Mr. President, a good barometer to measure the world's humanity is how we treat our most vulnerable, including our children. The Secretary General's report on children and armed conflict for 2023 is therefore most alarming. Tens of thousands of children have been robbed of their lives, their childhood, and their chances for productive futures because of armed conflict. Violence against children reached extreme levels with a 21% increase in grave violations, including against girls, with high instances of rape and other forms of sexual violence. The 35% increase of children killed and maimed tells a chilling tale of lack of compliance with international legal obligations, as well as lack of humanity. Whether it is in Gaza, Burkina Faso, Haiti, DRC, Myanmar, Sudan, Syria, or Ukraine, among others, children are bearing the brunt of the cruel and/or neglectful actions of adults engaged in armed conflict. Parties to various conflicts have completely lost sight that the protection of children must always be their first consideration. There is no glory in killing, maiming, violating, or denying children, and no objective justifies these violations. Mr. President, I must highlight the Israeli-Palestine conflict, where there has been an unprecedented increase of 155% in the scale and intensity of grave violations against over 100 children in Israel and over 4,000 in the occupied Palestinian territories. As the Secretary General's report said, this is, and I quote, blatant disregard for international humanitarian law and severe violations of international human rights law, end of quote. Guyana is concerned about reports that as many as 21,000 children are missing in Gaza, many trapped beneath rubble, detained, buried in unmarked graves, or separated from their families. What did they do? What harm could they have brought on the occupying power? We have lost thousands of them forever, but the fate of those left behind, albeit in a war zone and traumatized, does not have to be the same. Guyana calls again for an immediate ceasefire, as this is the only way to end this carnage and this war, and to protect the children of Palestine and Israel. Mr. President, turning to the three focus areas of today's debate. According to the report, denial of humanitarian access continues at alarming levels. More and more children in conflict situations are going without food and medicine and are at risk of dying from hunger and disease. This is compounded by lack of access to essential services such as water, sanitation, electricity, healthcare, and education. The protracted denial of humanitarian access continues to have long-term impacts on children, affecting their growth and development and increasing their vulnerability to other violations and abuses, including recruitment and use, abduction, rape, and other forms of sexual violence. Parties to conflicts must facilitate unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief. It is an international legal obligation and not a political bargaining chip. Also of deep concern is the increased attacks on schools and hospitals and an upsurge in their military use in direct contravention of international humanitarian law. In Sudan, for example, high numbers of attacks on schools and hospitals and their unlawful use, as well as attacks on protected personnel, have led to the collapse of the health system and widespread disruption in education. Mr. President, as we navigate these difficult times, the Security Council must use all the tools at its disposal for the protection of children against these grave violations. The Council must continue to prioritize the inclusion of child protection provisions and capacities in mandates of United Nations peacekeeping operations and special political missions. With several of these set to transition over the coming months, it is essential to focus on continuity of child protection programs, both by UN country teams and national authorities. These efforts must be supported by adequate resources and personnel. Mr. President, dear colleagues, without a doubt, impunity and failure to hold perpetrators of grave violations against children accountable are contributing to the increase in grave violations. Perpetrators must be held accountable. National courts and the International Criminal Court must scale up efforts in this regard. There must be timely and thorough investigations followed by prosecutions. This Council can also act through appropriate sanctions. This is the only way to deter continued grave violations. UN monitoring and verification of grave violations remain critical to inform response and prevention efforts. The CAC Working Group conclusions continue to promote accountability and encourage conflict parties to take specific actions to prevent and end violations against children. Guyana commends SRSG Gamba and her team, UNICEF, and the numerous NGOs for their indefatigable efforts to protect and provide life-saving support to children in armed conflict. In closing, as SRSG Gamba reminded, we must protect our children when we fail to bring them peace. We therefore call on all parties to conflict to adhere to obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law and human rights law. We also urge parties to conflict listed in the annexes to the Secretary General's annual report to engage constructively with the UN and the Special Representative to develop and implement action plans and other commitments to end and prevent grave violations against children. Finally, Guyana reiterates that peaceful resolution and prevention of conflicts remain the best protection for our children. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we thank the briefers for their contribution to this discussion. During conflict, children are one of the most vulnerable categories of the population. 25 years have elapsed since the adoption of Resolution 1261, which established the Security Council mechanism to prevent and end violations against children. However, this year, the Secretary General's report has highlighted a 35% increase in the number of children who have been killed and maimed. For all, the reason for this sudden uptick is clear. That reason is the Israeli military operation in the Gaza Strip, where 2/3 of all casualties are women and children. In the Palestinian-Israeli conflict zone, we have observed all 6 grave violations against children perpetrated on a horrifying scale. The situation in Gaza is the main challenge in the protection of children for the entire international community. We grieve the children of Israel who died or were wounded on the 7th of October. The violence which they endured has no justification. However, these victims do not justify Israel's violations of IHL, international humanitarian law, in Gaza. Since October 2023, every day, dozens of children die and are maimed in Gaza. Only according to preliminary data, more than 13,000 children have already died. Several thousand have been trapped under the rubble of destroyed buildings. More than 20,000 have been orphaned entirely. The bodies of minors are being discovered in mass graves throughout the entire territory of the Gaza Strip. Children are dying not just as a result of Israeli missile strikes targeting residential areas, schools, hospitals, mosques, refugee camps, UN facilities where they seek refuge in vain. Children are also dying as a result of starvation, thirst, disease. Thousands of humanitarian workers continue to assume great personal risk in attempting to save the children of Gaza and to alleviate their suffering. More than 50,000 children are in need of urgent assistance due to acute malnutrition. However, they are unable to have access to the necessary assistance. This is because Israel has essentially blocked humanitarian access, stripping the people of Gaza of the last hope for survival. Education and healthcare in the Strip have been destroyed. Children who were born and raised under the occupation have been stripped of even a hope for a future. Nor is the situation on the West Bank any better. There, too, has been a sharp rise in violations, including murders and maiming, arbitrary detentions of minors who endure torture and other cruel treatment, including sexual violence in Israeli prisons. The quantity of violations in the report, more than 8,000, is shocking. Verified cases alone far surpass the indicators in other conflict situations. However, what is even more appalling are the 23,000 violations which are yet to be verified. We trust that the United Nations will focus all efforts and resources to restore the full picture of what is transpiring and that all perpetrators will be held to account. We believe that for the United Nations and for the Secretary General, this needs to become a point of honor. The Russian Federation, like the entire international community, will closely scrutinize this work. However, The main priority is the need for an immediate ceasefire. Only an immediate ceasefire will help to avoid new casualties and will help to ensure the delivery of humanitarian assistance. Mr. President, the deliveries of Western weapons is one of the most serious factors behind the outbreak and spread of conflict and, as a consequence, civilian casualties, including children. All are aware of the fact that the litany of weapons provided by the West cannot be used without relevant assistance, including vis-à-vis guidance. We are talking about Ukraine, where weapons provided by the West, first and foremost weapons provided by the United States, are being used first and foremost against civilians, including children in Russian regions. Just a few days ago, on the 23rd of June, the Kiev regime mounted yet another grievous terrorist attack against civilians in Sevastopol. The Ukrainian armed forces, the UAF, attacked a municipal beach in Sevastopol, where 5 people died, including 2 children, including a 2-year-old toddler. The overall number of the wounded and dead is up to 151 people, including 27 children, many of whom are in serious condition. U.S. ATACMS systems carrying cluster munitions were used to carry out these killings. Furthermore, the advisor to the head of the advisor to the head of office of Zelensky, Mikhail Podolyak, stated that in Crimea there can be, and I quote, no beaches or tourist areas. Apparently, you see, he views Crimea as a military camp, and in this way, Kiev acknowledges that it is deliberately targeting civilian objects, including those where children are located. However, we have not heard any condemnation of this attack from the United Nations. And this is far from the first instance of Western weapons being used to cause deaths and suffering for both Ukrainian and Russian children. However, they, like the lion's share of violations against children by the Ukrainian armed forces and units, are not duly reflected in the Secretary General's report. The report effectively disregards the fact that the gross and systematic violations of IHL by Ukraine emanate back which began in 2014, that these are ongoing. There are daily shellings of civilian residential areas targeting vital infrastructure, civilian infrastructure. These are the methods that are used by the Kiev regime. Attacks against civilian objects in Russian regions are being used with the use of UAVs, kamikaze drones, as well as multiple launch rocket systems. The trademark of the Ukrainian units are attacks targeting passenger cars carrying civilians, including children. The armed groups under the control of the Kiev regime are deliberately targeting civilian objects, including schools, kindergartens, and medical facilities. The Ukrainian armed forces are responsible for the deaths of 192 children and the maiming of 554 children on the territory of the Russian Federation only in the period from February 2022 to April 2024. They also bear responsibility for the deaths of 129 and the maiming of 503 children on the territory of Donbass in the period from 2014 to 2022. These are but a few instances. On the 30th of December 2023, Ukraine shelled a holiday celebration in Belgorod where there was a New Year's tree and a skating rink. 5 children died. On the 15th of February this year, during Ukrainian shelling targeting a school stadium, a 1-year-old girl was killed. On the 20th of July, a Ukrainian drone attack in Crimea resulted in a child suffering a deadly shrapnel wounds. Only in 2023, more than 1,000 medical and educational institutions in the Russian Federation were destroyed or damaged by the UAF. Since February 2022, the Ukrainian forces carried out more than 1,625 attacks on civilian infrastructure objects in 28 regions of the Russian Federation, and 10 of them resulted in casualties among minors. Russian authorities have reported and recorded all the crimes perpetrated by the Kiev regime. The Parliamentary Commission on the Investigation of Crimes by Kiev against Children is continuing to operate. On the website of the Russian Federation, there is a report for 2023 of the Commission on Crimes Perpetrated by Kiev against Children. However, in the report of the Secretary General, these figures and subjects are not reflected. It appears that Russian children are not of interest for the United Nations and they do not need its protection. And here we wish to draw attention to one of the most serious breakdowns in the functioning of UN mechanisms for the protection of children. I refer to politicization. Politicization is the only explanation for the absence in the annexes of the list of parties listed in the annexes to the report, the absence of the UAF in violations against children. The joint plan with the United Nations to prevent violations, does this really give Kyiv license to kill and maim Russian children? Politicization is the only explanation for the presence in this list of the Russian armed forces. And here there's a need to stress that the figures of violations which are attributed to Russia in the report have not been verified independently. Their source is the well-known OHCHR mission in Kyiv, which is under the control of the Ukrainian authorities and receives data from them. Russia does not have access to the details of this information for verification purposes, and these details have not been provided to us. However, even according to this unverified data, there has been a positive momentum that has been observed, which unfortunately has nonetheless not resulted in the deletion from that list. Despite that, Russia is committed to the protection of children in armed conflict, including during the course of the special military operation. We are undertaking all systematic measures to that end. All of this time, we have demonstrated openness in cooperation with the UN on this issue, including with the special representative of the Secretary General on children in armed conflict. President, to conclude, we wish to touch on the fact that the main threat to children continues to emanate from terrorist and extremist groups engaged in armed conflicts. For them, their favored method is the recruitment of children, abduction, sexual violence, and the use of children as human shields, as well as erecting obstacles for the deliveries of humanitarian assistance. The most complicated situation in terms of the terrorist threat is unfolding in the Sahara-Sahel region, specifically Mali and the CAR, in Afghanistan, and in Syria. In Myanmar, armed groups such as the so-called People's Defense Force continue their tactic of attacks against schools and the brutal murders of entire families alongside children. At the same time, the information provided from the government of Myanmar is being ignored. In Syria, in the territories not under Damascus's control, in Idlib in the northeast of the country, Kurdish units abducted more than 50 Syrian children for recruitment since the beginning of the year. Over the course of many years, there's been a catastrophic situation in Al-Hol and Rosh IDP camps. This situation remains unresolved, and in these camps, there are 29,000 children, the majority of whom are under the age of 12. This is the largest number of arbitrarily detained minors in the world. However, we did not see in the report any call for addressed to the occupying power, that is the United States, under whose control these camps are currently held. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Mr. President, I thank you for convening today's open debate on children and armed conflict. I also thank former Secretary General and Deputy Chair of the Elders, Ban Ki-moon, Special Representative of the Secretary General, Virginia Gamba, UNICEF Executive Director of Humanitarian Action and Supply Operations, Tel Chaiban, and very brave child briefer for their comprehensive briefings and insightful recommendations. Sierra Leone reiterates its strong support for the CAC agenda of the United Nations. We express our thanks to the Secretary General for his comprehensive report, outlining the many ways children in conflict situations continue to be impacted by the unprecedented horrors of conflict-related violence, and the detailed analysis of 26 conflict situations for the reporting period January 1 to 31 December 2023. We commend the Office of the SRSG CAC, the UN Monitoring and Reporting Mechanism Team, and the Security Council Working Group on CAC for the role they play in strengthening our collective understanding of the specific ways war impacts children, and for their resolve to reinforce international legal and normative standards for the protection of children's rights in armed conflicts, and for spurring active commitments and measures to end and prevent grave violations. We also thank UNICEF and respective country task force on monitoring and reporting for their resilience in humanitarian response, data collection, high-level and community engagement in advancing the commitments in Security Council resolutions 1261, 1612, and many other relevant resolutions for the promotion and protection of the rights of children. 25 years since the adoption of Resolution 1261, children around the world continue to face rampant violations and denials of their rights in conflict situations. The Secretary General's reports on alarming 21% increase in violations from 2022 levels, reflecting the perilous circumstances disproportionately facing children. We continue to witness children's lives being destroyed by horrifying escalations in localized and cross-border conflicts. Children are more likely to be abducted, killed or maimed by bombs or bullets, recruited by armed groups or exposed to sexual violence, see their schools and hospitals reduced to rubble or denied access to life-saving aid. Rising global food insecurity resulting from negative effects of climate change and economic downturns also exacerbate the risks to children's survival and well-being. Today, more people are forcibly displaced globally than at any other time since the beginning of the century. The use of explosive weapons in populated areas, EWIPA, has resulted in deaths, physical injuries, and psychological trauma, particularly for children, destroying basic services and hindering civilians' ability to safely return and rebuild once conflict ends. Mr. President, Sierra Leone wishes to strongly reiterate our support for the existing body of international, regional, and national tools instrumental to addressing these violations against children. As signatory to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and its original protocol on the involvement of children in armed conflicts, the Paris and Vancouver Principles and the Safe Schools Declaration, and the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, Sierra Leone is committed to the protection and promotion of the right of every child. In expressing grave concern that children, especially girls, are at a greater risk of experiencing forced sex, sexual exploitation, abuse and violence, both in peace and during conflict, Sierra Leone has made the elimination of and prevention from all forms of exploitation, abuse and violence against children a top priority. In addition to legislation protecting the rights of children and mandatory sentencing guidelines for perpetrators of rape and sexual abuse of minors, the Sierra Leone Parliament unanimously passed the Prohibition of Child Marriage Act 2024 just this past week. The Act seeks to protect children below the age of 18 from sexual exploitation and forced marriage. Sierra Leone is of the view that the promotion and protection of the rights of children, including their mental and physical health, should be a compelling responsibility for all governments. Children are entitled to special care and assistance, especially in perilous times. They have no role to play in armed conflicts, must be recognized as children according to standardized age assessment guidelines and be treated primarily as victims. In the face of such worrying trend of gross violations, Sierra Leone wishes to share its perspective on urgent actions needed to advance United Nations CAC agenda. Firstly, we stress the importance of open dialogue to achieve full implementation of international legal instruments and political commitments to protect children in conflict situations. This is critical both for government forces and non-state actors. We recommend the efforts of UN country teams who engage in the negotiation and implementation of national strategies and action plans to prevent recruitment, use, and detention for alleged association with armed groups and facilitate their release, handover, reintegration, and repatriation as we have seen in South Sudan and Iraq, leading to the release of 7,506 children and reintegration of 10,600 children, respectively. We applaud innovative approaches taken, as seen in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where unilateral declarations by armed groups led to positive outcomes. We call for open dialogue with all sides to conflict as key to sustaining lasting child protection. We view this as an avenue to address the urgent need for education, sensitization, and preventive action on explosive ordinances which continue to kill and maim children across the world, as seen in Somalia and Niger. Sierra Leone also believes that sustained and constructive engagement, not just by country teams, but by member states and regional organizations, will augment the preservation and transfer of child protection measures, knowledge, and capacity, particularly from United Nations peacekeeping operations and special political missions at community and government level, especially in Mali, Niger, and Somalia, where there are mission drawdowns. Secondly, we echo our call for respect for international humanitarian law and human rights law. We urge all parties to the conflict to refrain from actions that put children in harm's way, whether directly through attacks on civilian populations and infrastructure, as reported in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory, and in other ways, including hindering access to health care, education, and humanitarian support, as reported in Afghanistan and Ukraine. Sierra Leone strongly condemns all forms of attacks on UN personnel and humanitarian access, and underscores that the use of schools and hospitals as military sites erodes our protected status. We risk hard-earned global sense of stability and security if these standards continue to be breached and threaten any possibility of sustainable development. We therefore strongly call on all sides of conflict to uphold the principle of distinction and ensure rapid, safe, systematic, and unimpeded access of humanitarian assistance to all children. To lay emphasis, we call for accountability for gross violations at all levels, including through international inquiries and adjudicating bodies. Our final point of action is enhanced support for child protection capacities and resources. We note completion of action plans as reported in the Lake Chad region and Iraq, and observe that beyond checkbox exercises, sustained effort is required. We commend all contributors advancing child protection and urge for sustained support in addressing underlying conditions which expose children to multiple vulnerabilities due to their gender and ethnicity. In the face of continued violations, escalating and protracting conflicts and underlying conditions, we call for sustained political and financial support for the effective functioning and mainstreaming of country teams and monitoring and reporting mechanisms within national governance structures. We also urge for accountability to end impunity. Sierra Leone commits to strengthening child protection provisions in all relevant mandates of United Nations peacekeeping operations, special political missions, and peace support operations. Mr. President, today's sobering briefing compels us to avert our minds not only to the present suffering of our children, but also to what the future holds for the victims of these grave violations if we as a global community fail to take impactful actions. We conclude by juxtaposing two African truisms, urging a communal responsibility that, quote, it takes a village to raise a child, end of quote, with the sad reality that, quote, a child that is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth, end of quote. Let us take action towards protecting children today for the preservation of peace and security tomorrow. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their statement. I now give the floor to representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I join others in thanking Special Representative of Secretary General Gamba. The report and your briefing today are a demonstration of your commitment and your dedication to work. Thank you very much. I also want to thank UNICEF Deputy Executive Director Chaiban, and I can assure you of Slovenia's support for your 4 recommendations that you presented today. I want to thank the former Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, for his briefing. And I want to say that we share his trust in the need of the unity of the Council to ensure a better future to our children across the globe. And our special gratitude to the child briefer today. Slovenia applauds your courage to address the members of the Council, to share your personal story, and we want to thank you for the advocacy that you're doing. Mr. President, the latest Secretary General report on the children and armed conflict once again portrays persistent negative trends of grave violations against children, reaching the highest numbers of violations ever recorded should sound an alarm on the erosion of respect for international law that we are witnessing today. Particularly situations in Sudan, state of Palestine and Israel, Haiti, Myanmar, Ukraine and Afghanistan require immediate attention. Other listed situations should be also treated without a delay. With a view to preventing future violations, we would like to urge all parties to conflicts listed in the annexes to the SG report to engage with the SRSG for children and armed conflict and the UN on the ground. Mr. President, we have always supported SRSG and children and armed conflict agenda, and we will continue to do so in the future. We want to thank Malta for successful stewardship of the working group, as well as other members for good cooperation. Cooperation which, among others, led to successful adoption of country-specific conclusions, with Afghanistan being the latest. Mr. President, in line with the concept note for today's debate, I would like to briefly touch on 2 grave violations. As we stated in the CAC debate in April, denying children access to humanitarian assistance is particularly cruel and inhumane. It's heartbreaking to read about the significant increase of the humanitarian denial. Humanitarian denial leads to acute malnutrition with effects for lifetime, provided the children survive. So rapid, safe and unimpeded humanitarian delivery must be guaranteed at all times and without a delay. For whom, if not for children? Further, attacks on schools are prohibited by international humanitarian law. Attacks on schools are denial of right to education, which is a denial of the future. Educational facilities are deliberately targeted or used for military purposes at an alarmingly increasing rate. So are teachers and students. Schools should be nurtured as safe havens for children, when instead education is under attack in far more too many countries. There should be zero tolerance for violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law, and we commend the ICC for its work in holding the perpetrators accountable. We welcome the adoption of a key strategic and policy documents of the Office of the Prosecutor, including the revised policy on children. But it is not only doom and gloom. In the past years, progress has been achieved in several situations, as was just reported today by the SRSG, through the engagement of state and non-state parties to conflicts with the UN. And we commend the SRSG and involved parties that have been removed from the annexes, which happens after concrete and time-bound activities to enhance the protection of children are attained. Mr. President, to conclude, we need to reflect on the situation in which we find ourselves today, a situation where the collective security based on respect for the Charter, international law and norms, and the Security Council decision is eroding like never before. Security Council and the UN member states need to reverse this trend. We hope we can recommit to these basic principles as soon as possible, and we will be working tirelessly to promote it. Thank you.
Thank the representative of Slovenia for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, President. President, I thank SISG Virginia Gamba, Deputy Executive Director Ted Chaiban, former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and the civil society representative for their briefings. 25 years ago, the Security Council adopted the historic Resolution 1261, establishing important guidelines for the protection of children in armed conflict. Over the years, the international community has become more aware of the need to protect children and increased humanitarian assistance, enabling more children in conflict zones to receive aid. Regrettably, however, the number of children subject to grave violations has stayed high and even increased by the year. Towards the end of last year, UNICEF warned that the Gaza Strip is the most dangerous place in the world to be a child. According to the latest SG report, in the past year, the Gaza Strip has seen an unprecedented scale and intensity of grave violations of children. The conflict has lasted over 8 months, claiming the lives of more than 15,000 Palestinian children. That is, around 60 children die on average every day. 90% of the children are undernourished due to lack of food. Over 600,000 are unable to return to school. We've seen the images in the media of children dying in front of their families, breaking the hearts of parents everywhere. At the beginning of this month, when the world rejoiced in the celebration of the International Children's Day, children in Gaza received their gifts in the form of bombing and shelling, casting a lifelong shadow. We should have long ago said stop to such a human tragedy. Israel should listen to the strong appeals from the international community and stop its collective punishment of the Palestinian people. We welcome the listing in the SG's annual report of the perpetrators of grave violations against children in the Gaza conflict. We believe it is a timely response to international calls. The pressing priority at this moment is to secure an immediate ceasefire in Gaza to ensure humanitarian delivery and to ensure genuine accountability for the perpetrators of violations against children. We call on the international community, especially countries with influence, to make tangible contributions to avoiding any further humanitarian catastrophe. China supports the Council's working group on children and armed conflict in promptly reviewing the situation of children in Gaza and taking necessary actions. President, from the Middle East to Europe, from the Caribbean to the Sahel, from the Horn of Africa to the Great Lakes region, millions small children are desperately awaiting assistance and yearning for peace in the inferno of war and conflict. An integrated approach at the international level is called for to ensure effective actions are taken to protect the collective future of humanity. First, putting an end to armed conflict effectively. The ultimate solution to save children in conflict is to protect them from conflict in the first place. The Council should stay committed to the political settlement of hotspot issues, do more in diplomacy, mediation and good offices, work vigorously for the cessation of fighting and the end of violence in Gaza, the Sudan, the DRC, Ukraine and so on, so as to resolve differences and animosity through dialogue and negotiation. It is important to make sure that external interference will not prolong or extend the conflict. It is even more important to watch out for any act of deliberately inciting tensions for one's own gain. Second, scaling up humanitarian assistance. In many conflict-afflicted regions, children suffer from malnutrition, lacking access to health care and medicine. Insufficient humanitarian funding is the #1 challenge. There must be increased assistance from the international community, in particular traditional donors. At the same time, humanitarian and children-related issues should not be politicized or weaponized. Children living in countries such as Afghanistan and Syria deserve the same level of assistance. Parties to the conflict must genuinely assume their obligations under international humanitarian law to ensure safe and unimpeded humanitarian access and the safety of humanitarian agencies and workers. Third, Severe punishment must be enforced against violations of children. The Council's resolutions explicitly prohibit 6 grave violations against children. Unless the perpetrators are held accountable, international fairness and justice would be severely eroded. The Council must impose more forceful sanctions against Haitian gangs to cut off their weapon supply and to combat such heinous acts such as child recruitment and killing. Together, we must object to the forced displacement and arbitrary relocation of Palestinian children, and advance progress in the identification and repatriation of children abducted by terrorist organizations in Iraq and Syria. Fourth, ensuring children's education and development. Education is indispensable to a child's healthy growth, shielding them from terrorist propaganda and vital to preventing conflict and building peace. Attacking hospitals, schools, and other civilian infrastructure is nothing short of giving away children's future and must be condemned in the strongest terms. The Summit of the Future and other major UN agenda must be leveraged to assist countries in conflict in eradicating poverty, achieving universal education, and bridging the digital divide to accelerate the implementation of the children-related SDGs. President, as an ancient Chinese saying goes, respect the elderly as you do your own, care for the young as you do your own. The international community must uphold this idea of empathy to safeguard the future of humanity. We must work jointly to silence the guns and achieve lasting peace. Alongside the rest of the international community, China will continue to make relentless efforts to promote peace and development for children across the globe so that our future generations can join hands to build a better future together. I thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président.
President, I'd like to thank Ban Ki-moon, Special Representative of the representative of UNICEF and the Special Representative and the Child Briefer for their briefings. Children are the first victims of wars, and the annual report reminds us of the absolute need to combat the scourge of violence committed against children in conflicts. The 21% increase in the number of violations in 2023 is shocking, and it should be shocking to us all. France urges those perpetrators to immediately put an end to these abuses. And we encourage the United Nations to redouble efforts to achieve this goal. In Sudan, serious violations committed against children have increased by 480%. The parties must cease the combat and put no hindrance to humanitarian assistance. The Russian aggression against Ukraine continues to have terrible consequences on children. Russia is responsible for deaths, mutilations, and the forced transfers of children, as well as attacks on schools and hospitals. We call on them to put an end to these serious violations and to immediately give Ukrainian children back to their families. In Gaza, thousands of children have been killed, and all the others are suffering from the ongoing conflict, and this must cease. France demands an immediate and lasting ceasefire, as well as the liberation of all hostages. President, given the alarming increase in this scourge, it is critical that we act. We must implement all of the instruments we have at our disposal to ensure the protection of children and to combat impunity that those who violate their rights often benefit from. France calls on all states to ratify and implement the Convention on the Rights of the Child and its optional protocols, as well as the Rome Statute, which led to the establishment of the ICC. With UNICEF, we are carrying out a campaign to make the Paris Principles and Commitments universal. These are now supported by 115 states. The universal endorsement of this document and the Safe Schools Declaration is critical for us to combat these violations, the violations of children's rights. We call on those who have not yet done so to endorse this document. This Council must continue to support the monitoring and reporting mechanism. It must have the necessary means to allow the Secretary-General to establish a complete and objective list of infamy. France will continue its financial support to this mechanism this year. The working group must be able to swiftly adopt its conclusions, which must be implemented on the ground. We call on all concerned parties to cooperate with the United Nations, including the Office of the Special Representative. President, since its establishment, the Children and Armed Conflict agenda has made it possible for considerable progress to be made. This is one of the major successes of the Security Council in the last 20 years. Since 2005, more than 200,000 children enrolled in armed groups or forces have been taken out of the conflict theater, and this includes over 7,500 last year. We must continue and amplify our efforts, and the UN must continue its support to projects to protect children, including those focused on prevention and reintegration. We must continue to work to protect children so that they can live, study, and grow up freely. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you so much for calling this very important debate, and I want to thank Special Representative Gamba for your very thorough and thoughtful presentation. I wish also to thank UNICEF Chaban and former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon for their valuable insights. And for the young man referred to as the child, let me thank you so much for your sharing your story with us and for your courage. And I hope that you continue to advocate for young people and share your experiences with others. 15 years ago, then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon addressed a gathering at UNICEF focused on children and armed conflict. He explained that, and I quote, "The recruitment and use of children in warfare violates international law. It also violates our most basic standards of human decency," unquote. Much has changed since 2009. Ban Ki-moon now bears a different title on his Security Council placard, and I had the privilege of sharing the stage with him in Seoul for a discussion on the Sustainable Development Goals earlier this year, and I'm really grateful to see him here again so soon, and that he's here today with the other members of the elders. But despite the former Secretary General's efforts and the efforts of many of those in this room, the CAC agenda item remains unfortunately evergreen. This year's annual CAC report provides a sobering snapshot of the devastating impact of conflict on children. In 2003, the United Nations reported a 21% increase in instances of the 6 grave violations against children. That's thousands upon thousands of children subject to sexual violence and abduction, recruitment, and use as child soldiers, attacks on schools and hospitals, and denial of humanitarian aid. We see in Sudan now the largest displacement crisis in the world. For more than a year, young boys have been recruited by the 2 warring parties, the SAF and RSF, as child soldiers, and young girls have been sold into sexual slavery. Millions more are going hungry, with a child dying every 2 hours in one camp in North Darfur alone. We also see it in Ukraine, where children have experienced the horrors of Russia's senseless, full-scale invasion. And despite Russia's efforts to distract us this morning, the report details dozens upon dozens of cases of children abducted, detained, tortured by Russian armed forces and other affiliated groups. You might come away from this discussion, this briefing, believing Ukraine is carrying out an attack on itself, a war against its own people, and that Russia's unprovoked attack didn't happen. that Russia has no responsibility. In Haiti, schools have been shuttered due to security concerns, and children continue to be used in criminal activities and acts of violence on behalf of gangs. In Myanmar, scores of children have been maimed and killed by the military regime, and tens of thousands more face food insecurity, displacement, sexual violence, forced conscription, and the threat of unexploded ordnances. And in Gaza, children have borne far too much of a war set into motion by Hamas on October 7th. Thousands have died, and even more have lost limbs, loved ones, and any semblance of safety. The report only underscores the urgency of achieving a ceasefire consistent with Resolution 2735. Of course, the fighting could stop today if Hamas agreed to the deal on the table to which Israel has already agreed. Instead, its leaders cynically hide themselves in a network of tunnels and their weapons and ammunitions in schools, mosques, and hospitals, putting Palestinian children at risk to protect themselves. These cowardly, craven tactics do not diminish Israel's obligation to protect civilians, including children in Gaza, and to further coordinate with the UN in facilitating humanitarian assistance. If famine sets in, children will suffer the most. But let me be clear, there's no moral equivalence between Israel and Hamas, none, and the surest way to improve the situation of children in Gaza is for Hamas to take the deal without delay, without conditions. Colleagues, there have been small glimmers of hope that include the outcome of the SRSG's engagement with parties to conflict, which resulted in the release of more than 10,000 children from armed groups and armed forces, and we thank her for her efforts. As the largest donor to UNICEF, the United States continues to advocate for children and continues to strongly support the CAC agenda, including through reintegration programs for children associated with armed forces and armed groups in several countries like the DRC, Nigeria, and Iraq. But there's far more that must be done. We must ensure that robust psychosocial support is given not only to children who have experienced trauma, but to their caregivers as well. We must take into account the disproportionate risk faced by girls, including conflict-related sexual violence, and work to meet the long-term mental and physical needs of child survivors. We must safeguard medical, nutritional, and hygienic support for children and their families, which serve as a bedrock for their education and their mental health. And we must strengthen the international community's child protection capacity and ensure all states respect international law, with those named in the report entering into action plans with the SRSG's office. And the then Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, said back in 2009, we must not rest until all children feel safe in their homes, schools, and communities without fear that they will be forced into war, unquote. That is the urgent charge before us. Let us work together and without delay to help this young man who's sitting across from us today become a leader in his country. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And let me thank all the briefers, from the eldest to the very youngest generation, for their powerful and courageous testimony today. The Secretary-General's report is horrifying. Grave violations regarding children and armed conflict rose by 21% in 2023. 35% more children were killed and maimed. 32% more children were denied humanitarian access, and 25% more children suffered sexual violence. These grave violations have risen on a shocking scale. The devastating impact of conflict on children demonstrates the need for this Council to come together, as former Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon said, to uphold international peace and security, resolve conflict, and protect children. SOSG Gamba, the Children and Armed Conflict mandate is crucial, and its achievements are many. In the almost 28 years since its inception, up to 40 action plans have been agreed, and over a dozen parties to conflict have been delisted by engaging constructively with the UN in the interest of child protection. In 2023 alone, over 10,600 children formerly associated with armed forces or groups received protection or support. The Children and Armed Conflict mandate must continue this vitally important work. President, we've heard today about many grave violations against children, from the DRC to Sudan to Myanmar. Let me highlight two contexts in particular. First, Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. On October 7, Hamas committed appalling acts of terror against Israeli children. 47 Israeli children were abducted on October 7, 36 of whom were held hostage and suffered ill treatment by Hamas in Gaza. Babies have been separated from their mothers and fathers. 3 children were killed in captivity. It is abhorrent that 8 months on, children remain as hostages, and we reiterate our call for Hamas to release all hostages immediately. With the ongoing operations in Gaza, Palestinian children are suffering terribly, and children are paying the highest price for this conflict. Israel must abide by obligations to protect children under applicable international humanitarian and human rights law, urgently improve humanitarian access, and increase the flow of life-saving aid. We need to see a stop in the fighting to end the suffering of children. The fastest way to do this is for Hamas to accept the terms of the deal on the table. Second, President, Russia's illegal war continues to devastate the lives of Ukrainian children. This latest report highlights once again Russia's appalling campaign of forced deportation and subsequent attempts to change children's nationalities. We call on Russia to end its unjustifiable invasion of Ukraine, to cease the forcible transfer of Ukrainian children to the Russian Federation, and its efforts to force them to become Russian citizens. Russia should return these children to where they belong, Ukraine. We underline our determination to hold those responsible to account. President, we call on all parties to adopt and implement concrete and time-bound action plans to prevent and end these grave violations against children. As a Council, we must uphold the specific rights and vulnerabilities of children and amplify their voices. Last month, our Minister, Lord Benyon, convened our annual roundtable with children affected by conflict. He heard from girls from the DRC, South Sudan, Ukraine and the West Bank about how conflict has impacted their childhood. We must remember that children are not numbers. Every grave violation is a tragedy. Let us work today to deliver on the promises of the Children and Armed Conflict mandate and protect children wherever they are. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
President, I'm grateful for the information provided by the erstwhile Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, the Deputy Chair of the Elders, the Special Representative of the Secretary General, Ms. Virginia Gamba, and the Deputy Executive Director of UNICEF, Mr. Ted Chaiban. The brave testimony of the child briefer shows the urgent need to silence the guns. The Secretary-General's report tells of a 21% increase in the number of serious violations committed against children in 2023, which was therefore one of the most harrowing years for children in conflict scenarios. My delegation takes note of the list annexed to the report, which contains verified information about perpetrators of these violations against children, to which the Special Representative Ms. Gamba referred. The unprecedented number of children who have been killed, victims of sexual violence, displaced, abducted, incarcerated, arbitrarily recruited, and orphaned, is a call to attention for states in conflict, as well as the international community, and indeed for this Council. This is particularly deplorable when we are marking 75 years since the Geneva Conventions. Ecuador applauds the Presidency's interest in focusing this discussion on the impact that attacks on schools, hospitals, and other critical infrastructure and the denial of access to humanitarian assistance have on children's lives. And in this domain, I would like to stress the following 3 points. First, destroying children's safe spaces contradicts international humanitarian law. It goes against the children's rights as are laid out in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and it exposes them to risks such as recruitment, sexual violence, and forced displacement. Secondly, attacks on civilian and critical infrastructure directly affect the physical, mental, and social development of children. It means that they are defenseless, and it undermines their right to education and health services. Thirdly, restricting the work carried out by the UN's humanitarian aid teams, limiting the work of female staff, and interfering with the flow and destination of goods exacerbates children's vulnerability. President, as vice chairs of the Working Group on Children and Armed Conflict, Ecuador supports Ms. Gamba's team. We also support the monitoring and reporting mechanism, as well as the United Nations personnel working on the ground in their work to collect, systematize, and shed light on the grave violations committed against children, including among other efforts to establish measures to prevent these atrocities and to protect children. While we wait for peace to prevail, states urgently need to be supported in designing national frameworks to protect children, as well as to promote the universal accession to the optional protocol pursuant to the Convention on the Rights of the Child on Participation in Armed Conflicts, the Safe Schools Declaration, the Vancouver Principles, the Paris Principles and Commitments, inter alia. In addition, as protection measures, states, and particularly states involved in conflict, must recognize the following principles in their own legal frameworks and their protocols for action. First of all, that children remain children until they reach the age of 18. Secondly, minors recruited by armed groups must be treated as victims and not as former combatants. Thirdly, family reunification and dignified, safe, and voluntary return for children who had been forced to be displaced, in particular those who are traveling unaccompanied, is critical. And fourthly, we must bolster the implementation of demining plans to reduce the risk of death and mutilation as a result of improvised explosive devices. Lastly, sustainable peace and justice are mutually reinforcing. It is therefore critical that states commit to bring to justice those responsible for committing grave violations of children's rights, promoting, if necessary, cooperation with international mechanisms to ensure accountability. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Mr. President, I wish to thank you for the organization of this briefing. I also wish to address my gratitude to the former Secretary General, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, the Special Representative, Secretary General, Madam Gamba, as well as the Deputy Executive Director of UNICEF, Mr. Ted Chaibon. We also wish to thank Jean-Vie for his powerful testimony. Mr. President, there is no second chance for childhood. In a number of armed conflicts, children fear for their lives at the very time as we currently speak. Their deaths are unacceptable, and their survival is far too frequently accompanied by traumatic experiences which remain etched in their bodies, their memory, and their actions for the remainder of their lives. Switzerland is profoundly alarmed by the horrific plight of children in a number of contexts. The Secretary General's report, which we express gratitude for, paints a bleak picture of the recruitment and use of children at a large scale in Myanmar and the DRC, the abduction and the killing of children in Israel and in the north of Nigeria, the inconceivable number of children killed and maimed in Gaza and Sudan, as well as humanitarian access which falls well short of needs in both of these contexts. Attacks against schools and hospitals in Myanmar and Ukraine, and violence, including sexual violence perpetrated by gangs in Haiti, with the largest number of grave violations ever verified, that is an increase of nearly a quarter as compared to last year. There is no other way of stating the following. We are collectively falling short of our duty to children. This needs to change, and I shall outline 3 courses of action. Firstly, it is time to redouble and to reaffirm our support for the Children and Armed Conflict agenda of the Security Council. The tools issued from the 13 relevant resolutions can bring about positive changes in conduct and should be applied in an independent, credible, and impartial way. In this regard, we take note of the new entries in the annex of the report. We urge all listed parties to adopt a meaningful commitment with the United Nations to prevent and end all grave violations. The monitoring and reporting mechanism remains the backbone of the agenda. Switzerland supports this financially in Syria and Yemen. And it is important for the conclusions of the working group of the Council to be adopted, insofar as they are critical to facilitate progress on the ground. Second, the withdrawal of United Nations missions should not be carried out to the detriment of the protection of children. We have observed with grave concern that the number of verified grave violations has been stagnant and even increased in a number of transition contexts, specifically, for example, in the DRC. UN country teams should be in a position to continue relevant protection and monitoring activities during and after transitions. It is therefore our duty to see to it that the mandates for transition take this into account. Switzerland has contributed to this by financing UNICEF and by seconding child protection specialists to UN agencies, for example, in Mali, following the withdrawal of MINUSMA. Third, the rising trend in verified cases of killings, maimings, and attacks against schools and hospitals, as well as denial of access to humanitarian assistance, needs urgently to be reversed. Switzerland calls for respect for international humanitarian law by all parties at all times. We also recall Resolution 2730. This was adopted by the Council last month on the protection of UN and humanitarian personnel, which includes those working to protect children. Furthermore, we encourage states to both sign and implement the Safe Schools Declaration. The right to education needs to be guaranteed. To that end, Switzerland shall continue to finance the Education Cannot Wait Fund. Mr. President, peace and respect for international law are the best protection for children. Specifically, international humanitarian law, human rights, and international refugee law need to be respected. In this regard, we also call upon member states to ratify the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child concerning the involvement of children in armed conflict. In the same vein, as a member of the Security Council, we have a duty to redouble efforts to find and support political solutions to conflicts and to prevent them. Humanity owes to the child the best it has to give, said the humanitarian and founder of Save the Children, Eglantine Jebb. It is time that we, with the means and the responsibility to step up our actions and efforts to protect girls and boys who will build our societies of tomorrow. Thank you.
Representative of Switzerland for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Mr. President, Moot, SRSG Gamba, and UNICEF Deputy Executive Director Shaiban, and also the child briefer, Mr. Janvier. Mr. President, my delegation thanks the Secretary General for his annual report on children and armed conflict, covering the period from January to December last year. We welcome the focus of this year's open debate, covering, among others, the denial of humanitarian access and attack on schools and hospitals. We look forward to the guidance note on denial of humanitarian access to be launched in this third quarter of 2024. Mr. President, in many parts of the world, children are victims of armed conflict and at extreme risk of violence, exploitation, and displacement. We are concerned that the report highlights an alarming increase of by 21% last year of grave violation against children. We note that these figures does not reflect the full extent of this violation. When we talk about grave violation against children, the current situation in Gaza comes to mind. I believe that everyone in this room will agree. The Israeli occupying power continue its attack on the population in Gaza and in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. The listing of Israeli armed and security forces among the parties that commit grave violation affecting children and situations of armed conflict is an important step in the right direction. There are no words to express the extent of the tragedy in today's world, where in Gaza, within a few months, more than 15,000 children were killed. More than 19,000 children were orphaned. Not to mention the estimated 4,000 children still buried under the rubble. Not to mention the amputated children, thousands of them. Not to mention children actually detained by the Israeli occupying power. It is also important to stress that more than 600,000 50,000 children live now in the street, among the rubble, without access to education. More than 3/4 of schools in the Gaza Strip were bombed by IDF and need now total reconstruction and or require major rehabilitation to be functional again. Also, as a result of the restriction of humanitarian aid by the Israeli occupying power, people in Gaza face catastrophic levels of hunger, and 50,000 children require today urgent treatment for malnutrition. In this regard, and according to the latest UN partnered IPC report on hunger levels released just yesterday, 96% of the population in Gaza, almost 2 million people, face acute food insecurity at crisis level or higher. 2 million, among which almost 500,000 are enduring catastrophic conditions. The IPC update underscored the high risk of famine across the whole Gaza Strip as long as conflict continues and humanitarian access is restricted. Moreover, Mr. President, we note with deep concern that 1 million people in southern Gaza are trapped without clean water, without sanitation, in a highly congested area in the burning summer heat. To conclude, and given that the situation in Gaza continues to quickly deteriorate, we reiterate our urgent call for an immediate ceasefire, as well as for an unconditional and unimpeded access for humanitarian assistance. And we urge the international community to shoulder its responsibility. It must act so that children in Palestine, especially in Gaza, are protected and can live a dignified and safe life, immune from violence, from oppression and terror. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate the Republic of Korea for convening this important annual debate on children and armed conflict. I also would like to thank Mr. Ban Ki-moon, Ms. Gamba, Mr. Chaiban, and the child briefer for their sobering briefings. I especially thank His Excellency Mr. Ban Ki-moon for today's briefing as Deputy Chair of the Elders, while commending his continuous and consistent commitment to international peace and security and human rights protection. Also, our sincere appreciation goes to the child briefer for his brave testimony. I express our greatest sympathy for the harrowing experiences the briefer have endured. Japan is deeply distressed by the Secretary General's latest report published in this month, outlining the extreme level of violence against children with a shocking increase from past years. We are particularly alarmed about the prolonged fighting in the Gaza Strip, which has led to a significant number of civilian casualties, including children. We also strongly condemn the Hamas for victimizing children in their heinous terrorism. Japan is also gravely concerned about the situation in Ukraine, where a number of grave violations verified, including the abduction of children by the Russian armed forces. Mr. President, we must act decisively and consistently to improve the situation of children in armed conflicts. In this regard, let me highlight 5 areas in which the international community should act immediately. First, Japan urges all parties to conflicts listed in the annexes to the latest report to engage constructively with the United Nations on the ground and special representative to put it in place prevention measures to protect children and develop action plans. Second, it is imperative to eliminate impediments to humanitarian assistance reaching children, and we must ensure full, safe, rapid, and unhindered humanitarian access. Unprecedented numbers of denials of humanitarian access were recorded in many places, including Gaza and Sudan. Japan is gravely concerned about the consequences of such denials, including disrupted education, child recruitment and use, malnutrition, and damage to physical and mental health. Third, one of the main causes of the killing and maiming of children is the use of explosive weapons in populated areas in violation of international humanitarian law. Japan has endorsed the EY political declaration and supports the efforts to implement their commitments. At the same time, Japan calls on other member states not having endorsed it to do so. Fourth, upholding children's right to education and supporting their development under armed conflict must be prioritized. Schools should serve as a safe havens for children. We must spare no effort to ensuring access to safe and quality education for children, particularly for girls who are disproportionately affected and become vulnerable to other grave violations such as sexual violence. Lastly, in countries like Mali and Sudan, where UN peace operations have withdrawn or are withdrawing amid high numbers of grave violations, the international community must ensure that child protection measures remain in place. Mr. President, according to the Secretary General's report, the highest number of grave violations were verified in Israel, Gaza, DRC, Myanmar, Somalia, Nigeria, and Sudan. Let me stress that no child should live in fear of attacks, nor should they fight on the front lines of armed conflicts. It is totally unacceptable that children's futures and dreams are being brutally taken away. All members and all parties to conflicts must recall that children are entitled to special protection under armed conflict. Mr. President, we are responsible for addressing human security threats to children in armed conflicts and removing all impediments in hindering children's ability to pave their future. Let us once again redouble our efforts to protect children under armed conflict. They deserve to live in dignity and grow up in a safe environment surrounded by friends and family without fear. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Mr. President, we wish to express Mozambique's gratitude to the Presidency for convening this important meeting on the situation of children and armed conflict. We thank and commend the important and valuable briefings provided by Ms. Virginia Gamba, Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflict, and by Mr. Ted Chaiban, Deputy Executive Director of Humanitarian Action and Supply Operations of the UNICEF. We wish to pay special homage to His Excellency, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, former UN Secretary General and Deputy Chair of the Elders, for his important statement and for continued devotion he shows to the ideals of the United Nations Charter. We were deeply touched by the courageous testimony of the child briefer. Mr. President, Mozambique agrees with the Secretary General's report that portrays the overall situation of children in situations of armed conflict as bleak, appalling, and of deep concern to all of us. It is our view that the alarming rise in grave violations against children reflects directly the worsening of conflicts around the world. As a consequence, children bear the brunt of both protracted and emerging crises. This situation demands an urgent, thorough, and comprehensive action to protect the most vulnerable. It does not come as a surprise that the highest numbers of grave violations in 2023 and currently are listed with a particular emphasis to those violations that took place in Palestine, more concrete in Gaza, and in the occupied Palestinian territories, as well as in other places where conflicts tend to be chronic and endemic. In that connection, we should not forget that the scourge of terrorism and violent extremism, which is rapidly spreading in Africa, is one of the most devastating causes of the plight of children in our continent and, in fact, around the world. This must prompt us to engage in frank and fruitful discussions on the concrete ways and means to effectively support member states in strengthening child protection measures. We should do so aware of the fact that peace is the fundamental conditio sine qua non for the protection of children in conflict situations and for these children to have an open door to a brighter future. And we should be mindful that states bear the primary responsibility to protect children in situations of conflict, particularly against terrorism and other non-state actors. It is imperative that parties to the conflict, to every conflict, adhere strictly to their obligations under international humanitarian law and international human rights law. They must take all necessary measures to protect children in conflict situations by avoiding, among others, direct direct and targeted attacks against civilians. In this regard, we encourage the continued engagement by parties in conflict with the United Nations. They are duty-bound to develop and implement action plans and other commitments to end and prevent grave violations. We are of the view that in conflict situations, children must be treated primarily as victims, including those associated with the armed groups or terrorist groups. This is in line with the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child on the involvement of children in armed conflict. Also, of extreme importance is to ensure a long-term and predictable funding for the implementation of reintegration programs for children that have been associated with terrorism and other armed groups. The provision of humanitarian assistance during conflicts is crucial to alleviate the suffering of the most vulnerable. In this vein, we reiterate our call on the parties to cooperate with the United Nations and humanitarian partners to ensure safe, rapid, and unimpeded humanitarian access, including the protection of humanitarian personnel, in line with the Security Council Resolution 2730. Within the same efforts, we consider that we must continue to engage in efforts aimed at strengthening child protection capacity in all United Nations peace operations and political missions. Mr. President, we would like to commend the United Nations country teams, particularly UNICEF, and all partners on the ground for their steadfast efforts in protecting children, often in very challenging circumstances. Mozambique reaffirms our commitment to intensify efforts to protect children's rights and prevent grave violations. We remain committed to engaging constructively with the United Nations and other partners in this endeavor. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the Republic of Korea. I extend my gratitude to SRSG Gamba and the Deputy Executive Director Chaiban of UNICEF for their comprehensive briefings. My special appreciation also goes to the former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon for the insights based on his vast experience during his tenure. I'm also deeply grateful to our child briefer for the sobering statement derived from his striking experiences. As our other Council colleagues have already indicated, we are overwhelmed by the scale of the grave violations against children in armed conflicts last year, the highest ever recorded in the CAC agenda's history. It is really appalling that even this unprecedented number includes just the UN verified cases, which only represent a fraction of the true magnitude of grave violations against children globally. With the armed conflicts raging across the world, children continue to pay the highest price. Their suffering is real and requires this Council to do more. In this regard, I'd like to focus on the following 2 points today. First, despite the deepening divergence of geopolitical interests, The international community must be united in protecting children by condemning perpetrators of grave violations against children and pressuring them to change their courses of action. Last year's sharp increase in the number of grave violations is largely attributed to conflicts that newly broke out or rapidly deteriorated. We are appalled that last year around 8,000 cases, 24% of the total, occurred in Israel and Palestine, mostly between October 7 and December 31st. The ongoing conflict in the Sudan has led to a 480% increase in grave violations. UNICEF's report that an estimated 19 million children, or 1 in every 3 in the Sudan, are out of school right now, is disturbing. We are also deeply concerned that around 2,800 UN-verified cases of grave violations were committed in Myanmar, including more than 1,000 cases of the recruitment and use of children by the Myanmar Armed Forces in particular and other related parties. In this regard, we note the Secretary General's new listing of some parties, including government forces, to the annexes of his report. I urge all listed parties to faithfully engage with the UN to sign and implement concrete action plans to end grave violations against children. Second, we should step up our efforts to ensure effective implementation of the CAC tools that we have developed for the last 3 decades, which includes the monitoring and the reporting mechanism, MRM, listing of perpetrators to the annexes of SG CAC report, SRSG-led action plans for ending grave violations, and the Security Council Working Group on CAC. The engagement of the SRSG Gamba's office based on these tools led to tangible achievements like the release of more than 7,000 children from armed forces or groups in 2023 alone. Now we must further develop CAC tools to be more effective, and it is crucial to strengthen child protection capacity on the ground by channeling more resources. In this vein, the Council should actively consider the inclusion of child protection mandates into the broader range of UNPKO missions and special political missions, as demonstrated by active contributions of child protection advisors in UNMISS, MONUSCO, and MINUSCA. Meanwhile, we encourage the UN to maintain its evidence and criteria-based CAC MRM. In this regard, we welcome the SRSG Office's current work to develop a guidance note on denial of humanitarian access. Colleagues, taking this opportunity, I'd like to draw attention to the grim situation for children in North Korea, a signatory of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Despite not being covered in the Secretary General's CAC report, we cannot say that children in the DPRK are living anything close to the lives that they deserve. According to the recent SG report on the situation of human rights in the DPRK, children in North Korea endure extensive human rights violations such as forced labor. Furthermore, they are sent to labor camps as collective punishment with their family members, and also can be sentenced to death only because they watched and distributed South Korean dramas. North Korean children also face a dire humanitarian situation caused by acute malnutrition and limited access to health care, while North Korean leaders enjoy luxury goods and recklessly pursue WMD programs. In closing, we strongly believe that the unique history of the CAC agenda's development demonstrates how multilateralism and the UN Secretary General's hands-on approach can positively impact children's lives. Paying tribute to the people striving to protect children The Republic of Korea, as a major partner of UNICEF and other child protection agencies, reiterates its firm commitment to supporting efforts to advance this crucial CAC mandate. Thank you. Now I resume my function as President of the Council. The representative of the Russian Federation has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. We wish to comment on what we have heard today from some Security Council members, the unfounded allegations against the Russian Federation, including vis-à-vis the abduction of Ukrainian children. But first and foremost, we wish to voice our shock at the fact that the United States, which has been helping Ukraine kill children in Russia, has been trying to lecture us. Let's recall once again that on Sunday alone, a U.S. ATACMS missile killed 2 children and wounded another 27. I now turn to the allegations about abductions and deportation. Those delegations are deliberately misleading listeners. We are talking about the evacuation of children from the areas where hostilities are being carried out, fully in accordance with IHL obligations as well as in full accordance with the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And now turning to the mention of the abduction and transfers in the report, they are dubious and they require additional explanations. Specifically, the abducted children could be regarded as cases emanating from marital disputes between parents. The overwhelming majority of children are arriving in Russia together with their parents or other relatives, and they are being saved from shelling by the Ukrainian armed forces. The Russian side is not obstructing the maintenance of context or correspondence between children and their loved ones, irrespective of the location of the latter. As regards reunification of families, the Ombudsman on the Rights of the Child in the Russian Federation has been delivering assistance in this process, including with the participation of humanitarian mediators. Between the Russian and Ukrainian sides, to that end, there is a transparent process that has been established with a subsequent algorithm-related action. 70 children from 52 families have already been reunited with their relatives, and there is data about this, which is regularly published in bulletins. On the protection of children during the special military operation, the most recent issue was on the 20th of June. Moreover, in this bulletin, there are responses to all insinuations from Western countries, which their representatives so love to repeat. This document is accessible in the English language, and it is located on the website of the Ombudsman on the Rights of the Child. It is openly available, and we advise colleagues who are interested in facts, not propaganda, to read this and familiarize themselves with this. And in this context, we should pay particular attention to what has emerged in April. I refer to information of the Ukrainian National Police that more than 160 Ukrainian children whom Ukraine believed were brought to Russia were unexpectedly found in Germany. It is clear that all the other allegedly abducted by Russia, the other minors allegedly abducted by Russia, should be tracked down in Germany and other countries. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation. I wish to remind all speakers to limit their statements to more than 3 minutes in order to enable the Council to carry out its work expeditiously. The flashing lights on the color of the microphone will prompt speakers to bring their remarks to a close after 3 minutes. I now give the floor to representative of Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the Republic of Korea presidency for convening this important debate and the briefers for their remarks. I also recognize the continued occupation of the seat of the Soviet Union by the dictator's envoy. As a proud representative of a state that on this day, June 26, 79 years ago in San Francisco, signed the UN Charter, I avail myself of this opportunity to congratulate all member states, except Russia, on this anniversary. all but Russia, because Russia is a fair dodger and a vandal here. Russia has never has it either signed and ratified the Charter or adhered to its provisions. As publicly acknowledged by the then USSR and later the Russian envoy to the UN, the whole process seemed in 1991 to be a simple change of a country name plate. But this apparent simplicity in letting Russia occupy a permanent seat triggered an entire chain of violations and horrors of war, including crimes against children. The thematic report we are discussing today presents an alarmingly bleak picture of the situation for children, with the highest number of grave violations ever recorded. This reality stands in stark contrast to our common determination embedded in the UN Charter to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. It is also not the present or future we desire for our children and those to come. We extend our appreciation to Special Representative Gamba and her office, UNICEF, and all child protection organizations for their invaluable work. Ukraine commends the cooperation established with the Special Representative and her office, including with the implementation of the Joint Preventive Action Plan. We reiterate our standing invitation to the Special Representative to visit Ukraine and our full support for the CAAC mandate. It is just one day that the Security Council allocated to address the heinous and horrifying crimes against children that the Special Representative Gamba has briefed about. She and her team deal with these crimes every single day. They deserve our full support, not only moral one, but also with all the necessary resources required to ensure a full and effective implementation of the CAAC mandate. Mr. President, Russia's aggression has had catastrophic consequences for children in Ukraine. According to the Ukrainian prosecutors, at least 1,389 children have been wounded and 551 killed. The figures are not final, as work is continuing to establish numbers in the areas temporarily occupied by Russia. 1,895 children have gone missing during the hostilities. 15 cases of sexual violence against minors have been recorded. According to the Ministry of Education of Ukraine, to date, almost 4,000 educational institutions across Ukraine have suffered bombing and shelling, and 365 of them have been destroyed completely. Nearly 20,000 Ukrainian children have been forcefully transferred or deported to the Russian Federation or temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. Russia is obstructing the repatriation process by imposing additional conditions and hiding verification procedures. If the Russian representative insists that there is a transparent algorithm, as he said, why then the international organizations have no access to the Ukrainian children? To date, only 736 have been repatriated. Mr. President, we welcome the decision of the UN Secretary General to keep the Russian armed forces and affiliated armed groups on the list of grave violators for the killing and maiming of children and attacks on schools and hospitals. Russian Federation has not only failed to take appropriate preventive measures, but has also significantly increased the intensity of shelling of civilian infrastructure and densely populated areas across Ukraine. The only root cause, I repeat, the only root cause of children's sufferings is the unjustifiable war of aggression launched by Russia. If the dictator's envoy truly cares about the fate of children, it is his duty to provide his boss with full information about the Secretary General report and to convey the common message of the white membership to stop the war. As Russia persists so far in its desire to wipe my country out of the earth, Ukraine has the legitimate right to hit all military targets on the territory of Russia and the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. And quoting Nebenzia himself, and I quote, "If the air defense systems had not operated, then there would not have been any victims, among civilians at all, end of quote. Ukraine is striving for a comprehensive, just and lasting peace based on the UN Charter. We seek such peace for our children, whose normal childhoods have been shattered by relentless Russian bombardments, missiles and drones. We urge all those who have not yet joined to actively engage and contribute to the process of implementation of the peace formula to do so. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Liechtenstein.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. We thank you for organizing this important debate and the distinguished briefers for their presentations. Liechtenstein reiterates the continued relevance of the children and armed conflict agenda, as the Secretary General's report for 2023 sadly illustrates. The mandate of the SRSG, including its effective tool of listing parties that have committed one or more of the 6 grave violations against children, is needed now more than ever and must be protected. The frequency of grave violations committed against children is shockingly high, with a 21% increase in 2022 and the largest number of violations in at least a decade. Of particular concern is the dramatic rise in children killed in conflict. The deteriorating situations in Gaza, Sudan and Myanmar are especially alarming and require the Council's immediate attention. Mr. President, we are deeply troubled by the nearly 8,000 children reportedly killed in the Gaza Strip. Such a large number of casualties and massive suffering among children are unacceptable, as is the targeting of homes, shelters, schools, and hospitals, places where children and their families should feel safe. The psychological and physical impacts of living in the conflict zone endure for a lifetime. Mr. President, the children of Ukraine are also paying an extraordinary price for Russia's aggression, marked by the 335 documented attacks on schools and hospitals last year alone. We remain deeply troubled by the continued abduction of Ukrainian children, including the abduction of 122 children by Russia. In this regard, we highlight that the International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants against Russia's president and the Children's Rights Commissioner, whose work was praised by the Russian delegate earlier this morning, for the war crimes of unlawful deportation and transfer of children. We reiterate the obligation of all states parties to the Rome Statute to comply with their obligations in the execution of arrest warrants, including those issued for the former Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and the Chief of General Staff Valery Gerasimov earlier this week. We also recall the essential contacts policy of the United Nations. It is our collective responsibility to ensure that every child can be spared the scars of war. The protection of schools, hospitals, and other health facilities are key in this respect. We therefore call upon all states to support the Safe School Declaration and to ensure the protection of hospitals, as well as of humanitarian and medical personnel. We recall Security Council Resolution 2730 on protecting the protectors, put forward by Switzerland in May, which we have co-sponsored, and emphasized the need for the full respect of international humanitarian law at all times. Mr. President, we are deeply troubled by findings of the Secretary General's report that reveal a 25% increase in conflict-related sexual violence, which disproportionately affects girls. Such crimes are often underreported, particularly also when perpetrated against boys due to stigma, cultural taboo, and lack of criminalization. As a result, male survivors of sexual violence are often unable to access legal remedies as well as medical and mental health services. We commend the tireless advocacy of organizations, including the Liechtenstein-based All Survivors Project, which raise awareness of this overlooked aspect of conflict-related sexual violence. All reported crimes must be vigorously investigated and prosecuted including by the International Criminal Court that has done groundbreaking work in this regard. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Liechtenstein for their statement. There are still a number of speakers remaining on my list for this meeting. I intend, with the concurrence of members of the Council, to suspend the meeting until 3 p.m. The meeting is suspended.